My stepmother locked me in the basement during my college graduation and said, "If I can't celebrate my son today, nobody celebrates anything." When I begged her to let me out, she whispered, "You should have died with your father." Campus police found me 8 hours later. That was 4 years ago. This morning, I inherited my grandfather's entire estate, and the lawyer told me she's been trying to have me declared dead. The lawyer slid the death certificate across his desk, and I saw my own name printed in serif font under deceased, filed March 2023, signed by someone claiming to be my next of kin. The document looked official enough to be real, except for one problem. I was sitting in a leather chair in downtown Boston, very much alive, staring at proof that my stepmother had tried to erase me from existence. Attorney David Nguyen adjusted his glasses and said the words that made my hands go numb. "She filed this 6 months after your grandfather's stroke. She's been collecting his Social Security, accessing his accounts, and preparing to claim his estate. If you hadn't come in today for the reading, she would have succeeded." I looked at that death certificate and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not a shock. Recognition. This was exactly who she'd always been. I'd been living 3,000 miles away in Seattle for 4 years, working as a software engineer and trying to forget that Diane existed. My father had married her when I was 14, 6 months after my mother died of ovarian cancer. I'd spent the next 4 years of high school in a house that stopped feeling like home the day she moved in. She had a son from her first marriage, Kyle, who was 2 years younger than me, and somehow both her entire world and her weapon of choice. Every achievement I had was met with a comparison to Kyle. Every milestone was overshadowed by whatever Kyle was doing that month. When I got accepted to Northeastern University with a partial scholarship, she told my father it was a waste of money because Kyle would need college funds soon. My father had pushed back then. That was before the accident. Dad died 3 weeks into my sophomore year. Drunk driver, head-on collision on Route 128, dead before the ambulance arrived. I was 19 years old and suddenly an orphan with a stepmother who'd never pretended to like me, and a stepbrother who'd perfected the art of being invisible whenever Diane's cruelty needed a witness. The funeral was a blur. I remember Diane crying theatrically while Kyle stood next to her looking uncomfortable. I remember my grandfather, my mom's father, putting his hand on my shoulder and telling me I always had a home with him. I remember Diane's face when he said it, the flash of something vicious before she rearranged her features into grief. I should have paid more attention to that look. My grandfather, Thomas Fitzgerald, had built a small fortune in real estate development. 3 properties in Boston, 2 in Cambridge, a vacation house on Cape Cod, and enough invested assets to generate comfortable passive income. He'd never been flashy about it. He lived in the same modest house in Brookline he'd bought in 1978, drove a 15-year-old Camry, and wore the same wool cardigan until it had holes in the elbows. After my dad died, he tried to stay in my life. Weekly phone calls, care packages during exam season, an open invitation to move in with him after graduation. Diane hated every second of it. She'd inherited everything my father owned when he died, which wasn't much beyond the house and some life insurance. But she knew my grandfather had real money and that I was his only grandchild. That knowledge ate at her like acid. The situation escalated slowly over my junior and senior years. Diane would call me periodically, always with some manufactured emergency that required me to come home. Kyle had been in an accident. The house had been broken into. She'd found something of my father's that I needed to see immediately. Every time I drove the 3 hours back to our suburb west of Boston, the emergency would evaporate upon my arrival. Kyle would be fine. The break-in would turn out to be a raccoon in the trash. The important item would be a random object she'd claim my father treasured, but that I'd never seen before. She'd always have an excuse for the confusion. She'd been so worried, so emotional, so stressed from raising Kyle alone. My grandfather saw through it immediately. "She's testing your compliance," he told me during one of our phone calls. "Seeing how far she can jerk you around. Don't go unless it's verified by someone else." I followed his advice, and the calls from Diane became more hostile. My graduation was scheduled for May 19th, 2019. I'd finished my computer science degree with honors and had a job offer from a tech company in Seattle starting in July. My grandfather had planned to fly out for the ceremony. He'd booked his flight, reserved a hotel room, and told me he was proud enough to burst. 3 days before graduation, Diane called and said my grandfather had fallen and was in the hospital. She gave me the name of the hospital, the room number, everything. I called the hospital directly to verify because I'd learned. The nurse told me they had no patient by that name. I called my grandfather's cell phone, and he picked up on the second ring, perfectly healthy, confused about why I was asking if he'd fallen, he said. His voice went sharp. I should have told him what she'd done. I should have documented it. I should have known she was building towards something worse. Graduation day started normal. I woke up in my campus apartment at 6:30 a.m., showered, put on my cap and gown, and felt that specific mixture of excitement and terror that comes with finishing a major chapter. My grandfather was flying in that afternoon. The ceremony started at 3 p.m. I had plans to meet him at his hotel at noon for lunch. At 10 a.m., I got a call from Diane. She was in town. She'd driven out to surprise me. She wanted to see my apartment before the ceremony. She sounded almost pleasant, which should have been a red flag the size of a billboard. But I was 22 and stupid enough to hope she'd decided to be a normal human being for one day. I gave her my address and waited. She arrived 40 minutes later with Kyle. He looked miserable, which was his default state around his mother, but I barely noticed. I was too focused on the fact that Diane had brought a bakery box and was smiling. "Congratulations, sweetheart," she said. Sweetheart. She'd never called me that in her life. She handed me the bakery box. Quote 9. They weren't my favorite. My mother used to make snickerdoodles. Diane knew this because I'd mentioned it once at Thanksgiving years ago, and she'd made a comment about how ethnic snickerdoodles sounded. But I took the box and opened it because I was trying to be gracious. The cookies looked perfect, professional, definitely not homemade. Kyle was standing behind her, staring at his phone, radiating discomfort. "Can we talk?" Diane asked. "Privately? I want to apologize for some things before your grandfather gets here." That should have been the moment I said no. That should have been the moment I recognized the trap. Instead, I nodded and led her to my bedroom while Kyle stayed in the living room. My campus apartment was a converted house. 4 bedrooms, shared kitchen, basement, nobody used except for storage. Diane looked around my room and made approving noises about how clean I kept it. She asked about my job offer. She asked about Seattle. She acted like a person I'd never met. Then she said, quote 13. It made no sense. Why would she store my father's things in my campus apartment when I was moving across the country in 6 weeks? But I was distracted by the time and the ceremony and the fact that my grandfather would be landing soon. So I led her downstairs. The basement was unfinished. It was a concrete floor, exposed beams, one hanging light bulb, a furnace in the corner. There were a few boxes of my roommate's belongings stacked against one wall. Nothing of mine. I turned to tell Diane this and she shoved me. Hard. I stumbled backward and hit the concrete wall. Before I could react, she was through the door and I heard the bolt slide into place. The sound of that bolt is burned into my memory. Metal on metal. Final. I stood there for maybe 5 seconds trying to process what had happened. Then I ran to the door and pounded on it. Quote 14. Her voice came through the wood, calm and steady. Quote 15. I stopped pounding. Kyle was supposed to graduate high school this week. He'd failed 2 classes and wouldn't be walking with his class. I'd heard about it from my grandfather, who kept tabs on Diane's household through some mutual acquaintances. She'd been furious. Blamed the teachers. Blamed the school. Blamed everyone except Kyle, who'd spent his senior year skipping class to smoke weed behind the gym. And now, she was taking it out on me. I started pounding again, yelling. She didn't respond. I heard footsteps going back upstairs, then silence. I called 911 from my cell phone. The dispatcher answered and I tried to explain the situation. I'm locked in a basement. My stepmother locked me in. I have graduation in 5 hours. I need someone to come let me out. The dispatcher asked for my address, asked if I was injured, asked if there were weapons involved. I gave her the information, and she said someone would be there soon. I hung up and tried calling my roommates. None of them answered. They were all at pre-graduation brunch with their families. I called my grandfather. Straight to voicemail. He was on the plane. I called the university police. They told me they'd send someone to check on the situation. I sat down on the concrete floor and waited. 20 minutes passed. 30. Nobody came. I tried the door again, throwing my shoulder against it. The bolt held. The door was solid wood, old construction, built when people actually made things to last. I wasn't getting through it without tools I didn't have. At 11:30, I heard voices upstairs. Relief flooded through me. Someone was here. I yelled and pounded on the door. The voices got closer. Then I heard Diane's voice, sweet and concerned. "Officer, thank you so much for coming. I think there's been a misunderstanding. My stepson has been under a lot of stress with graduation. He's been saying strange things lately. I'm worried about him." My blood turned to ice. I screamed louder. "I'm down here. She locked me in the basement. Check the door." The officer's voice was male, young, uncertain. Quote 19. Diane's response was perfect, confused, worried. "The basement? No, it's just storage. We don't even use it. Look, you can check if you want." I heard footsteps descending the stairs. I kept yelling. The footsteps reached the bottom and stopped outside the door. Then Diane's voice again, quiet, like she was confiding something painful. Quote 21. The silence that followed lasted forever. Then the footsteps retreated back upstairs. The officer's voice, more distant now. "If you need help with a mental health crisis, you can call this number." A pause. "Good luck with everything." They left. I heard the front door close. I stopped yelling because my throat was raw and my voice was breaking. I sat back down on the concrete and tried to understand what had just happened. A police officer had come to the address I'd given 911, heard me screaming for help, and left anyway because Diane had spun a story about mental health episodes. I called 911 again, different dispatcher. I explained the situation again, emphasized that I'd already called once, that an officer had come and left without helping me. This dispatcher sounded skeptical. "Sir, if an officer already responded and determined there was no emergency, I can't send another unit without additional evidence of a crime in progress." I asked what evidence she needed. She said if I was really locked in against my will, surely someone would notice I was missing when I didn't show up to graduation. Then she told me to stay calm and ended the call. Stay calm. I was locked in a basement by a woman who just told a cop I was mentally unstable. My graduation was in 3.5 hours. My grandfather was landing in an hour and would come looking for me. Stay calm. I tried to think strategically. The basement had 2 small windows near the ceiling, the kind that let in light but were too narrow for a person to fit through. I stood on a box and looked out one of them. I could see the side yard, empty except for trash cans. I couldn't see the street. I banged on the window. It was old glass, thick, and the frame was painted shut. I hit it with my fist, and nothing happened except my knuckles split and started bleeding. I looked around for something to break it with. There was nothing. The boxes contained winter clothes and old textbooks. The furnace was bolted to the floor. I went back to the door and examined the hinges. They were on the other side. I couldn't remove them. The bolt was industrial, the kind landlords install when they want to secure something permanently. I was trapped in a 10 by 15 concrete box with no tools, no water, and no way out. At 1:15, I heard the front door open upstairs. My grandfather's voice. I screamed. I threw myself at the door and screamed his name until my voice cracked. I heard him moving through the apartment. Quote 26. Then Diane's voice, slightly out of breath like she'd been hurrying. Quote 27. Grandfather's voice, suspicious. "Where is he? His ceremony starts in less than 2 hours." Diane's response was smooth. Quote 29. I screamed louder. The basement walls were concrete. The ceiling was insulated for sound. My voice barely carried. I heard my grandfather say, Quote 30. Diane laughed, light and easy. Quote 31. I listened to them talk for 10 minutes. Diane steering the conversation away from me, talking about Kyle's plans for the summer, asking about my grandfather's flight. He kept circling back to me. Where exactly had I gone? When had I left? Did I seem upset? Diane had an answer for everything. I'd seemed fine, happy, excited, just wanted some air. My grandfather didn't sound convinced, but he stopped pushing. At 1:40, he said he was going to check the campus. Maybe I'd gone to see a professor. He left, and I heard Diane lock the door behind him. Then silence. I sat down and put my head in my hands. My ceremony started in 80 minutes. I was going to miss my own graduation because my stepmother had locked me in a basement and convinced everyone I was voluntarily absent. The absurdity of it felt like a weight on my chest. At 2:30, my phone battery died. I'd been texting my roommates, texting classmates, posting on social media asking for help. Nobody was checking their phones. They were all at the graduation venue, getting ready, taking photos with their families, living the moment I'd worked 4 years to reach. I sat in the dark and felt time move like a physical thing, slow and crushing. I thought about my mother, about my father, about whether they'd be disappointed in me for ending up here, locked in a basement by a woman they'd welcomed into our family. I thought about how Diane must have planned this, chosen graduation day specifically because everyone would be distracted, brought Kyle as a witness who wouldn't contradict her story, called 911 preemptively so she could control the narrative when the police arrived. She'd orchestrated this like a military operation, and I'd walked right into it. The first indication that something had gone wrong from Diane's perspective came around 6 p.m. I heard heavy footsteps upstairs, multiple people, voices. One of them was my grandfather, sharp and angry in a way I'd never heard him. Quote 32. Another voice, official. Quote 33. Campus police. Finally. My grandfather's voice again. I'm telling you something is wrong. He wouldn't miss this, not voluntarily. Diane's voice, still calm, but with an edge now. Quote 35. Grandfather, cold. Quote 36. That got my attention. I stood up and started pounding on the door again. My hands were raw. My throat was destroyed. But I pounded and croaked out his name. The footsteps came fast. Multiple people on the stairs. My grandfather's voice right outside the door. Why is this bolted? Diane's response, confused and innocent. The sound of the bolt sliding open. The door swung inward and light flooded the basement. My grandfather stood there with 2 campus police officers behind him. He looked at me and his face went white. I was covered in concrete dust. My knuckles were bleeding. My face was streaked with tears and dirt. I'd sweated through my shirt. I opened my mouth to speak and nothing came out except a croak. One of the officers, a woman in her 40s with sergeant stripes, pushed past my grandfather and grabbed my arm. Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention? I shook my head and pointed at Diane. She was standing at the top of the stairs, backlit, her expression carefully arranged into shock. Sergeant Allison Parker, 23 years with campus police, 9 of them as a supervisor. She got me upstairs and sat me down on the couch while her partner called for an EMT. My grandfather sat next to me, his hand on my shoulder, not speaking, just present. Diane stood in the kitchen doorway with Kyle behind her, both of them watching. Sergeant Parker asked me to explain what happened. I told her everything. The call from Diane, the request to see the basement, the shove, the locked door, the 911 calls that went nowhere, the officer who'd come and left. Parker's expression got harder with every sentence. When I finished, she turned to Diane. Ma'am, is what he's saying accurate? Diane's response was a masterpiece of concerned confusion. Quote 41. Parker looked at me. Quote 42. I told her my battery died. She asked for my number and called dispatch while we waited. The 911 verification came back within minutes. 2 calls from my number, one at 10:53 a.m., one at 11:42 a.m. Both calls logged an officer response. Both calls marked as resolved without incident. Parker's jaw tightened. Who responded to the first call? Her partner checked his radio log and gave her a name. Officer Derek Thompson, 2 years on the force. Parker told him to get Thompson to the apartment immediately. Then she turned to Diane. Ma'am, I need you to explain how this door got bolted with your stepson inside if you left at 11 a.m. Diane's mask started to crack. Quote 45. Parker's voice dropped 20 degrees. What kind of episodes? Diane glanced at Kyle, who was staring at the floor. Mental health issues. Since his father died, I've been worried about him hurting himself. My grandfather made a sound like he'd been punched. Quote 48. Officer Thompson arrived 15 minutes later. Young, maybe 24, nervous. Parker asked him to explain his response to the 911 call. Thompson said he'd arrived at 10:55, spoke to the homeowner who explained her stepson was emotionally unstable, heard noises in the basement but was told it was just old pipes. The homeowner had seemed genuinely concerned about her stepson's mental state. Thompson had determined there was no emergency and cleared the call. Parker asked him if he'd attempted to verify the source of the noises. Thompson hesitated. The homeowner said the basement was just storage. I didn't think it was necessary to check. Parker's expression could have stripped paint. Quote, 50. Thompson had no answer. Parker turned to Diane. Quote, 51. The Miranda rights continued, but I stopped listening. I watched Diane's face cycle through shock, rage, and calculation before settling on defiant victimhood. Kyle looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The EMT arrived and checked me for injuries. Dehydration, abraded knuckles, bruised shoulder from hitting the door. They wanted to take me to the hospital, but I refused. I just wanted water and sleep, and for this day to be over. My grandfather sat with me while Parker took statements. She interviewed Kyle separately in the kitchen. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw his face when he came out. Guilty and relieved. Parker told me later that Kyle had confirmed everything. He'd watched his mother lock me in the basement. She'd told him if he said anything, she'd make sure he ended up in the same situation. He was 16 and terrified of her. He'd sat in the car for 8 hours waiting for this to be over. Parker documented everything, took photos of my injuries, photographed the basement door and the bolt. Collected my phone even though it was dead. She told me I'd need to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement. Then she led Diane out in handcuffs. Diane didn't look at me. She looked at my grandfather and said, quote, 52. My grandfather's response was quiet. I'll make sure you never get near him again. The aftermath moved in slow motion. Diane was arraigned the next day on charges of unlawful restraint and filing a false report. The DA's office, represented by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Kowalski, 8 years in the office with a focus on domestic violence cases, added a charge of false imprisonment after reviewing the evidence. Diane posted bail using money from my father's life insurance. She was ordered to stay away from me. Kyle was placed with his biological father in New Hampshire. I gave my statement to the police over 3 hours, walking them through every detail. They interviewed my roommates, my grandfather, the campus police. They pulled the basement door and had it analyzed. The bolt showed fresh installation marks. Diane had installed it specifically for this. They found the hardware store receipt in her car. She'd bought the bolt 3 days before graduation. This wasn't spontaneous. This was premeditated. My grandfather hired a lawyer for me, Margaret Holloway, 15 years practicing criminal and civil law in Massachusetts. She told me I had grounds for a civil suit against Diane for emotional distress, assault, and a dozen other charges. She also told me Officer Thompson was facing an internal investigation for his handling of the 911 call. The university was investigating why campus police took 8 hours to find me when I'd called them directly. Everything was documented. Everything was building toward justice. But I couldn't feel it. I'd missed my graduation. The university had mailed me my diploma like a consolation prize. My grandfather had tried to organize a private ceremony, but I told him no. The moment was gone. Diane had taken it, and I couldn't get it back. I started having nightmares about being trapped in small spaces. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. in my apartment and feel the walls closing in. My grandfather suggested therapy. I said I'd think about it. I didn't. I moved to Seattle in July as planned, put 3,000 miles between myself and everything that had happened. The job was good. The city was beautiful. I made friends. I dated. I built a life that looked normal from the outside. But I never went back to Boston. My grandfather came to visit me twice a year. We talked on the phone weekly. He told me Diane's trial kept getting delayed, legal maneuvering, continuances. At one point, her lawyer tried to argue she'd had a mental health crisis and didn't understand her actions. The judge rejected it. Kyle sent me a message through my grandfather. He was sorry. He should have said something. He was living with his father now and doing better. I never responded. I didn't blame him, but I couldn't absolve him either. He'd watched it happen. That was enough. Diane was eventually convicted in September 2020, 16 months after she'd locked me in that basement. She got 3 years probation, mandatory counseling, and a permanent restraining order keeping her away from me. No jail time. The judge said because she had no prior criminal record and had expressed remorse, leniency was appropriate. She hadn't expressed remorse. She'd stood in court and said she'd been trying to protect me from myself, that I'd been self-destructive and she'd panicked. The lies were so smooth they almost sounded true. I wasn't in the courtroom. I followed the proceedings through Margaret. When she told me the sentence, I felt nothing. 3 years probation, counseling, for 8 hours locked in a basement, and a lifetime of knowing the justice system valued my suffering at approximately 0. I thanked Margaret for her work and moved on. Or tried to. My grandfather had a stroke in November 2021. Massive. He spent 3 weeks in the ICU before being transferred to a rehabilitation facility. I flew back to Boston and spent a month with him. He couldn't speak clearly, but he could squeeze my hand. His lawyer, David Nguyen, told me his will was updated and everything was in order. I should have asked what that meant. I should have requested details. But I was focused on my grandfather's recovery and didn't think about logistics. He came home in January 2022 with round-the-clock care. I visited every other month, watched him slowly regain some function, but never fully return to himself. He died in his sleep August 2023. Peaceful, according to his caregiver. I flew back for the funeral. Small service. A handful of his old friends and business associates. No Diane. She was still bound by the restraining order. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I could finally close that chapter. David Nguyen called me 3 days ago. Asked me to come to Boston for the reading of my grandfather's will. I said he could just email me the documents. David said it needed to be in person. There were complications. That word made my stomach drop, but I bought a plane ticket and flew across the country. David's office was downtown, 20th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. He offered me coffee, and I accepted because I needed something to do with my hands. Then he opened a folder and slid the death certificate across his desk. My death certificate. Filed March 2023, signed by Diane Sloan as next of kin. I stared at it and couldn't process the information. "I'm sorry, what?" David explained. My grandfather's estate was worth approximately $8 million. 3 properties in Boston, 2 in Cambridge, the Cape House, investments, cash assets. All of it left to me as his only heir. Except Diane had filed a death certificate 6 months after his stroke, claiming I'd died in a car accident in Seattle. She'd submitted it to the probate court, along with a claim that as my stepmother, she was entitled to inherit on my behalf as my closest living relative. David had been trying to reach me for months. The email address on file was old. My phone number had changed. He'd finally tracked me down through my employer. If I hadn't come in today, Diane would have succeeded. The probate court had scheduled a hearing for next week to finalize the estate transfer. She would have walked away with $8 million that my grandfather had explicitly left to me. David pulled out more documents, correspondence from Diane's lawyer arguing for expedited processing, letters from Diane herself describing her grief over my death and her desire to honor my grandfather's memory by managing his properties. David had been suspicious and hired a private investigator who'd found me very much alive in Seattle, working at my job, paying my taxes, existing in easily verifiable ways. He'd submitted proof of life to the court and requested an emergency hearing. That hearing was tomorrow morning. I needed to be there. I asked how Diane had gotten a death certificate. David explained she'd filed it in a county where the clerk's office was understaffed and overwhelmed. She'd provided a fake accident report and forged signatures from a Seattle coroner's office that didn't exist. By the time anyone thought to verify the information, it had already been entered into multiple state databases. Correcting it would take months. David had already started the process, but showing up in person would be faster and more dramatic. I asked if Diane knew I was alive. David said yes. His investigator had confronted her last week with proof. She'd initially claimed it must be identity theft, someone using my name. When pressed, she'd stopped responding to communication. Her lawyer had filed an emergency motion to delay the hearing. The judge had denied it. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., I'd walk into a courtroom and prove I existed. 4 years after Diane had locked me in a basement, she'd tried to kill me legally. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed in a hotel near David's office and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about basements and death certificates and the specific kind of hatred that drives someone to erase another person. Diane had spent 4 years after my grandfather's stroke positioning herself for this. She'd filed the death certificate. She'd established herself as my closest relative. She'd probably monitored my grandfather's health, waiting for him to die so she could claim everything. The calculation involved was staggering. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. This was a long-term strategy to steal my inheritance by pretending I didn't exist. I thought about calling someone, my therapist, who I'd finally started seeing 2 years ago, a friend, anyone. But I didn't know what to say. Quote 55. Sounded like the premise of a bad thriller, except it was my life. The hearing happened in Suffolk County Probate Court. Judge Angela Thornton presiding, 19 years on the bench, reputation for not tolerating nonsense. I sat next to David in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and recycled air. Diane sat across the aisle with her lawyer, a nervous-looking man in his 50s named Robert Greaves. She looked older, hair completely gray now, deeper lines around her mouth. She didn't look at me when I walked in, just stared straight ahead like I was a ghost she refused to acknowledge. Judge Thornton reviewed the case file and asked Diane's lawyer to present his argument. Greaves stood and tried to explain that there had been a clerical error. His client had received information that her stepson had died and had filed the appropriate paperwork in good faith. When new information suggested otherwise, she'd been shocked and relieved. Judge Thornton stopped him. "Counselor, I've reviewed the death certificate your client filed. It contains multiple inconsistencies and appears to reference a coroner's office that doesn't exist. Does your client maintain she filed this in good faith?" Greaves hesitated. "Your Honor, my client was grieving and may have been confused about certain details." Judge Thornton turned to David. "Does your client wish to present evidence?" David stood. "Your Honor, my client is present in this courtroom. I believe that constitutes sufficient evidence." The judge looked at me. "Can you state your name for the record?" I did. She asked for identification. I provided my driver's license, passport, and social security card. She examined each one. Then she turned to Diane. Diane spoke for the first time. Her voice was steady, cold. The courtroom went silent. Judge Thornton leaned forward. Diane kept talking like she'd been waiting years to say this. "Tom Fitzgerald's money should have gone to my son. Kyle is the one who suffered. Kyle is the one who needed it. But Tom gave everything to him," she pointed at me. "So I fixed it." Judge Thornton's expression could have frozen fire. Quote 66. Diane shrugged. Quote 67. Judge Thornton called a recess and left the bench. When she came back 10 minutes later, she had 2 bailiffs with her. The bailiffs moved toward Diane. She finally looked at me. Quote 69. She said it like she'd been thinking it for 4 years, like it was a fact she'd made peace with. The bailiffs led her away, still talking. Judge Thornton addressed the courtroom. She banged the gavel, and it was over. David grabbed my arm because I'd stopped moving. "It's done. You won." I nodded but couldn't speak. 4 years of nightmares and 3,000 miles of distance, and Diane had still found a way to reach across the country and try to erase me. Except, this time, it hadn't worked. This time I'd shown up. This time I'd simply existed loudly enough that her lies couldn't hold. David walked me out of the courthouse. News cameras were already setting up outside. Someone had tipped off the media. Probably David. He gave a statement about fraud and justice while I stood behind him and tried to remember how to breathe. A reporter asked me how it felt to be declared alive. I told her I'd get back to her on that. We left before they could ask more questions. I needed to be anywhere but there. David drove me to my grandfather's house in Brookline. It was mine now. Everything was mine. The house, the properties, the investments. $8 million I'd never asked for and didn't know what to do with. I walked through rooms that smelled like my grandfather's cologne and felt like I was trespassing. The wool cardigan was still hanging in his closet, holes in the elbows. I sat on his bed and cried for the first time in 4 years. Not about the money. About the fact that he'd tried to protect me even after he died, and Diane had nearly destroyed that too. I pulled out my phone and called my therapist. Told her I needed an emergency session. She scheduled one for that evening. I said I'd pay whatever it cost. She told me to breathe. I tried. The district attorney's office filed charges against Diane within 72 hours. Grand larceny, forgery, identity fraud, attempted theft by deception, contempt of court, 7 charges total. The bail hearing was set for the following week, and I was asked to attend. I flew back to Seattle, told my boss I needed family leave, and flew back to Boston again. I was living in airports and hotel rooms, suspended between my old life and whatever came next. Diane's bail was set at $500,000. She couldn't make it. She stayed in jail. Her lawyer tried to argue she was a flight risk assessment error. The judge disagreed. Diane had already demonstrated willingness to commit fraud and deception. She'd remain in custody until trial. That trial was scheduled for January 2024. I'd have to come back again, testify again, relive the basement and the death certificate and every moment Diane had tried to erase me. Margaret came out of retirement to represent me again. She said this case made the first one look like a parking ticket. She was going for maximum sentencing. She wanted Diane to spend actual time in prison. Not probation, not counseling, prison. I told her to do whatever she thought was right. I stopped trying to feel satisfaction and just focused on surviving the process. The investigation into Diane's activities uncovered more. She'd been accessing my grandfather's accounts for over a year before he died. Small withdrawals, bill payments, nothing large enough to trigger alerts. After his death, she'd escalated. Tried to claim his Social Security benefits using the fraudulent death certificate. Filed false tax returns in my name, showing I'd died without assets. Applied for credit cards using my identity and immediately maxed them out. She'd built a comprehensive fraud operation around the idea that I was dead and couldn't contradict her. The Secret Service got involved because of the identity fraud. The IRS opened an investigation into the false returns. What had started as a probate dispute had become a federal case. Margaret told me this was good. Federal charges carried longer sentences. I told her I didn't care about the sentence. I cared about making sure Diane couldn't do this to anyone else. Margaret said that was the same thing. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I testified on day 4, walked the jury through graduation day, the basement, the 8 hours, the death certificate, the attempted inheritance theft. Diane's lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive, suggested I'd fabricated the basement incident to frame his client. Margaret destroyed him with evidence, police reports, medical records, campus police testimony. Officer Thompson, who'd been demoted after his mishandling of the 911 call, testified about how Diane had manipulated him. Kyle testified via video from New Hampshire. He described years of his mother's controlling behavior, how she'd become obsessed with my grandfather's money after my father died, how she'd told him I was, quote, 73, quote, the jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all counts. Sentencing happened in March 2024. Judge Thornton presided again. She listened to impact statements from me, my grandfather's estate lawyer, and several of my grandfather's former business associates. Then she addressed Diane directly. Quote, 74. Diane stood, looked at me. Quote, 75. Judge Thornton banged her gavel. Quote, 76. Diane was led out in handcuffs for the second time in my life. This time, she didn't look defiant. She looked like someone who'd finally run out of moves. I sat in the courtroom after everyone else left and felt the weight lift. Not all of it, but enough to breathe. 12 years. She'd be 68 when she got out. I'd be 36, old enough to have built a life so complete she couldn't touch it, old enough to have forgotten what her voice sounded like. That possibility felt like oxygen. I walked out of the courthouse into March sunshine and called my therapist. Told her it was over. She asked how I felt. I said I didn't know yet. She told me that was okay. Feeling would come later. For now, surviving was enough. I inherited my grandfather's estate officially in April 2024. $8 million. 3 properties in Boston rented to good tenants. 2 properties in Cambridge housing graduate students. The Cape Cod house sitting empty and perfect. I kept them all. Hired a property management company to handle the logistics. Used the rental income to fund a scholarship at Northeastern for first-generation students studying computer science. Named it after my mother and father. Set aside money for Kyle's education if he wanted it. He'd been a victim too, in his own way. Diane had destroyed him as thoroughly as she'd tried to destroy me. I wanted him to have a chance she'd never given him. I moved back to Seattle and returned to my job. My boss had held my position for 4 months. I owed him everything. I worked twice as hard as before and tried to remember what normal felt like. Went to therapy weekly, dated someone who didn't know about basements or death certificates, and who thought my worst trauma was a bad performance review. I didn't correct her. Some things are too heavy to share with people who haven't earned that weight. My grandfather's house in Brookline sat empty for 8 months. I couldn't bring myself to sell it, but couldn't imagine living there either. Finally, I flew back to Boston and walked through it one last time. Stood in the living room where he'd read me stories when I was 7. Sat in the kitchen where we'd had our last conversation before his stroke. Packed up his wool cardigan and a few photo albums. Left everything else for the estate sale. The house sold in 3 days to a young family with 2 kids. The wife told me they'd take good care of it. I believed her. I stopped having nightmares about basements in 2025. 5 years after Diane locked me in one. My therapist said trauma has its own timeline. You can't rush healing any more than you can rush grief. Both take the time they take. I accepted this. Started sleeping through the night. Started dating the person who didn't know my history more seriously. Told her eventually. On a rainy Sunday in October, while we were drinking coffee in my apartment, and she asked why I never talked about my family. I told her everything. The basement, the death certificate, the 12-year sentence. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, quote 77, not quote 78 or quote 79, just quote 80. It was exactly the right thing to say. We're engaged now. Wedding planned for next summer. Small ceremony on Cape Cod in my grandfather's house. The one piece of his estate I couldn't bring myself to sell. We've started renovating it, making it ours. She wants to paint the guest room yellow. I told her yellow is perfect. I think about Diane sometimes. She's in Danbury Federal Prison in Connecticut. 7 years into her sentence. She's been denied parole twice. Will be eligible again in 2029. I'll write another statement then. Explaining why she should serve every single day. I'm not vindictive. I don't enjoy her suffering. But I remember what she whispered through that door. You should have died with your father. Some things don't deserve forgiveness. Some people don't deserve second chances. I've built a life she can't touch now. A career, a relationship. Properties in my name that will never be hers. A scholarship fund that will help students long after I'm gone. I exist so loudly now that no death certificate could erase me. That's the real victory. Not the 12 years, not the $8 million. The fact that I survived her and built something beautiful anyway. My fiancé doesn't know this, but I still check obituaries occasionally, making sure I'm not in them, making sure Diane hasn't found another way to kill me legally. My therapist says this hypervigilance will fade eventually. I tell her I believe her. I don't. Some wounds heal, but the scars stay sensitive. I've learned to live with that. The coffee shop selfie, the Instagram post, the spreadsheet that broke everything open in the last story. This story doesn't have that. This story has a death certificate with my name on it and a stepmother in prison who thought she could erase me. Who came so close the margin of victory was me showing up to a lawyer's office 3 days before it was too late. That's horror. That's the nightmare. Not being locked in a basement for 8 hours, but being erased for 2 years without even knowing it. I wake up some mornings and verify I'm alive. Check my credit report. Google my name. Make sure I still exist in all the places that matter. My fiancé thinks I'm checking work email. I don't correct her. She'll understand eventually, or she won't. Either way, I'm here, alive, documented, impossible to erase now. That's what survival looks like. Not triumph. Just persistent, stubborn, documented existence. Diane tried twice to make me disappear. Once, literally. Once, legally. Both times, she failed. That's the story. That's the ending. She's in prison. I'm in Seattle planning a wedding and managing properties and building a life so solid it would take more than one person's hatred to destroy it. Some days that feels like enough. Some days it feels like everything. The wool cardigan with holes in the elbows hangs in my closet now. I wear it sometimes when I'm working from home. It still smells like my grandfather's cologne, even though that's impossible. Olfactory memory is strange like that. Holds on to things long after they should have faded. I wear it and remember that someone loved me enough to leave me everything. to try to protect me even after death. That love mattered more than Diane's hatred, built something stronger, created a foundation she couldn't crack no matter how hard she tried. That's the real inheritance, not the money, not the properties. The proof that being loved well creates armor that outlasts cruelty. My grandfather knew that. That's why he structured his will the way he did, making sure everything went to me and only me, creating documentation that would survive even fraudulent death certificates. He'd been protecting me his whole life. That protection didn't stop just because his heart did. I'll stand in his Cape Cod house next summer and marry someone who thinks I'm brave for surviving. I'll wear his cardigan under my suit jacket where nobody can see it. I'll look out at the ocean and remember what it felt like to be locked in a basement thinking nobody would come. And then I'll remember that somebody did come. Campus police, my grandfather, a sergeant who didn't stop until she found the truth, a lawyer who tracked me down across 3,000 miles, a judge who saw through every lie. Justice is slow. Justice is imperfect. Justice required me to show up and prove I existed. But justice happened. That has to be enough. That is enough. Diane thought she could erase me. She thought my existence was negotiable, something she could revoke with a forged signature and a lie. She was wrong. I'm still here, still breathing, still showing up, still building, still loving and being loved. She took 8 hours from me on a May afternoon in 2019. She tried to take $8 million 4 years later. She got neither in the end. What she got was 12 years in federal prison and the knowledge that I survived her, that I'm thriving despite her, that every day I wake up and live well is proof she failed. That's revenge. That's victory. That's what it looks like when you refuse to be erased. Some stories end with confrontation, with the victim facing their abuser and delivering a perfect speech about survival and strength. This story ends with me in Seattle, drinking coffee with my fiancé and planning which color to paint the guest room. Yellow. We're painting it yellow. That's the ending. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just alive. Persistently. Stubbornly. Impossibly alive. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.